Okay, I'm on to chapter 1 of Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society. And probably the hardest thing about this book is really having a complete grasp of what Ellul means by technique. Notice that he doesn't use the word technology, but technique. And from chapter 1, right away, we learn that though technique can encompass machine or machinery and that kind of technology, that is not the same thing that Ellul is talking about. In other words, the machine can be a sort of subset of technique, but technique is larger than that. So he distinguishes it from the machine. He says if we were to characterize the relations between technique and the machine today, we could say not only that the machine is the result of a certain technique, but also that its social and economic applications are made possible by other technical advances. And that gives you some clue as to where Ellul is going to go with the idea of technique. It doesn't remain in the physical realm, but also deals with the systems that human beings create to manage other physical techniques. So technique is something that applies to human behavior and how we organize ourselves and how we motivate people and all sorts of things beyond this. But technique, I sometimes use the term method as a sort of temporary substitute for technique sometimes. Sometimes it makes sense for me to do that in order to get a full grasp, or a little bit, I shouldn't say full, but a more complete grasp of what he's talking about. He makes the distinction between technique and machine clear in this statement here. He says, as long as technique was represented exclusively by the machine, it was possible to speak of man and the machine. The machine remained an external object, and man, though significantly influenced by it in his professional, private, and the psychic life, remained nonetheless independent. He was in a position to assert himself apart from the machine. He was able to adopt a position with respect to it. And see, Ellul thinks in modern times these two have not been able to stay as separate. Man cannot, at least psychologically, separate himself from the machine, but has become in a way part of it. So the human sciences have become a part of it. Now, I might just take a step back here before going any further and try to explain the bigger picture of where he's headed. For Ellul, there's something different about technique in modern times. Now, he does acknowledge in this chapter that even in ancient times, human beings had employed techniques for using certain tools, for instance, techniques for low-level political organization, even. But something about modern technique, it's sort of, at a certain point he describes it sort of like a snowball. There was a snowball effect in modern times where technique was piled upon technique, and at a certain point, technique took over and became a sort of self-moving. It took over itself, in other words, and became a sort of self-moving thing outside of human control. And I know this is hard to wrap your mind around. Believe me, I've had my trouble with it as well. We tend to think that our techniques or methods are at our disposal to use for human purposes, and that they always increase efficiency, and they aim at more convenience and all the things that we say that we want. But he points out again towards the beginning of this chapter some really glaring examples from the 20th century of how technique kind of on a roll in the case of war and ideological conflict, creates things that ultimately don't benefit anybody. And this is further proof that technique stands apart from just, it's not about economics, it's not about exclusively about uh, human planning as far as it actually benefiting human beings. Is further proof of it having a sort of life of its own. He says the techniques which have shown the greatest development are not techniques of production at all. For example, techniques in the care of human beings, such as surgery, psychology, and so on, have nothing to do with productivity. The most modern techniques of destruction have even less to do with productivity. The atomic and hydrogen bombs and the Germans' V1 and V2 weapons are all examples of the most powerful technical creations of man's mind. Human ingenuity and mechanical skill are today being exploited along lines which have little reference to productivity. So, again, we tend to think of our techniques being employed for rational purposes and in the capitalist system, but also in socialist and communist systems. I think productivity is high on the list of leaders of all kinds and societies of all kinds. But he's saying, but in this very glaring case of weaponry, which does take on a life of its own, called the arms race, and so it becomes something that feels inexorable, like it can't be stopped, like we're all victims of it. This is a dramatic case of technique becoming not only unproductive, but a danger to human beings. In this chapter, Ellul goes into the history of where modern technique arose, and giving it this special characteristic of what I call the snowball effect. He says at one point what really produced the general movement in favor of technique was special interest. And then he goes on to elaborate what this means. He says, in fact, the bourgeoisie has always been more or less involved with technique. They were the initiators of the first financial techniques and later on of the modern state. At the beginning of the 19th century, they saw the possibilities of drawing huge profits from this system, especially as they were favored by the crumbling of morals and religion and felt themselves free, in spite of the idealistic smokescreen they raised, to exploit individuals. This class put the interests of technique before the interests of individuals, who had to be sacrificed in order that technique might progress. So there we have, I should say, sounding like somebody to the left of center, in that he's criticizing the bourgeoisie for basically giving free rein to technique, to make for basically progress of all kinds, even to the point of exploiting individuals. But then in the next line or in the next page or two, he then points the finger at the left-wing socialist communists. He says Karl Marx rehabilitated techniques in the eyes of the workers. He preached that technique can be liberating. Those who exploited it enslaved the workers, but that was the fault of the masters and not of technique itself. Okay, well, I might stop and try to explain this a little bit as best I understand it. He's taken aim at the bourgeoisie and their desire to develop technique and to kind of give themselves over to techniques of advancing and expanding the economy and creating more products and finding markets to sell those products and creating a demand for those products, on and on and on. And then next he points the finger at Karl Marx and the leftists. And he says they have rehabilitated technique in the eyes of the workers. There was, some movements in the 19th century that were anti-technology and saw technology as the enemy, which is closer to the way Ellul actually thinks. But Karl Marx and his brand of socialism/communism was not anti-machine or anti-technology at all. And this is something that I think people who haven't studied Marx very much may get the impression, or may be under the assumption that Marx didn't like factory production because he criticized factory production for being dehumanizing and alienating. But Marx argued that it was the way that it was being used. Marx actually thought that factory techniques produced by the bourgeoisie could be used in a very efficient way and in a communal way to provide abundantly for all people. Marx was a materialist. He wanted people to live well. He thought that capitalism created a perverse incentive structure that made some people extremely rich and everybody else poor, and that it was illogical because it wouldn't have a market for its goods. That he thought that capitalism was going to implode on itself, and then we'd have the communist revolution, right? But Marx saw nothing wrong with the machinery. In fact, this was the great gift of the bourgeoisie to the future, was the creation of the infrastructure and the methods of production. What he didn't like was the marketing and the selling end of things. That technique he didn't like. And he thought it needed to be replaced with a technique of something like what we might call management. Notice how I keep using the word technique here. Basically, Ellul is saying that the capitalist bourgeoisie and the Marxists are both the same on this score. They both have a huge faith and reliance upon technique. The bourgeoisie in favor of, private industry and its development of technology and techniques of organizing the workers, and techniques of compensation and techniques of marketing and all that, as I said. And the Marxists, the communists, in favor of the techniques of managements of goods and services, planning, rational economic planning and distribution, and getting the most of factory production and all of that. So in his mind, they share this fundamental thing, which is very, very modern. It's this notion that human beings can develop methods for everything, to exploit and make efficient everything, but they become, as I said before, something that comes loose from human control. That at a certain point, when you see these things develop, the techniques that are developed, they point the way to even better techniques or more diverse techniques in different areas. And so pretty soon, the technique becomes, in a way, an end in itself. Ellul says that when in the 20th or the 19th, and I guess going into the 20th century, when the benefits of techniques were felt by the masses, and so this would be both in capitalist and in socialist and communist countries, when the techniques began to be felt by the masses, both because of government policy bringing them goods and services, and because of an expanding economy in the case of at least the capitalist system, more and more people became beneficiaries of various techniques, whether they were about products that they could consume, or whether it was methods of medical science, or whether it was political, governmental, service administration. More and more of their lives came under the domain of technique, which ostensibly is more or less under the control of either government and or big business. But as we keep moving on in this history that he lays out, you get the feeling that even government and big business aren't really ultimately in charge of technique, that, as I've said before, it becomes its own thing. Now, here's something that's interesting. He talks about how agriculture changed and about how this creates what he calls plasticity, which I take to be a sort of mental quality that makes it possible for people to accept, maybe with discomfort, but to accept ever more rapid change. He says the new agricultural techniques were plainly so superior that it was not possible to preserve the old open field system, the commons, the pastures, and the forests. Thus the final blow was dealt to the old organic peasant society. The peasant could not survive as such, and with him the whole of society entered into a state of flux. The plasticity we refer to came about in England as a result of this evolution in the use of land, which furnished the technical movement with the necessary manpower. Apathetic, vacant, and uprooted. Not only was this manpower necessary for the development of industry, the masses thus created were indispensable to faith in techniques and the spread of techniques. Okay, well, I find that very interesting on multiple levels, but probably the most important is this notion of plasticity, okay? That as the agricultural techniques changed, and there was more, for instance, maybe more grazing of cattle and sheep, maybe there was more, use of machinery to cultivate. So in both cases, you need a lot less people then on the land to do the farming. So all these people who'd lived on the land before, all the former serfs, the peasants, they took off to try to find some way to make a living in the cities, and they were met with absolutely no plan at that point, no technique of social welfare anyway, and so they were just extremely poor. They were at loose ends, as he says, apathetic, vacant, and uprooted. And he says that this is exactly the type of people who are able to be swept up in the technical movement. I imagine that he's thinking of, they're being hired at a daily rate or even an hourly rate into these factories, what Blake called satanic mills, right? These factories that basically used them like pieces of machinery, again, kind of sounding reminiscent of Marx in that case. But remember, Marx and the communist system that grew out of Marx and Engels' thought didn't want to disrupt the basic factory production method either. So we go from the pastoral life of relative independence, strangely enough, even as serfs. I think Ellul would probably say the average serf was more independent on his little plot of land working under the Lord than he would have been in the factory, wondering if he was going to be hired back for another 12 to 15 hours of back-breaking labor the next day. So this psychological state of plasticity comes about when people are shocked by rapid change, and it then takes on again a life of its own, where you have this large pool of people who can't think as well, have no real groundedness with which to critique or to analyze what is that's happening, and react, and so can be easily taken up into the machinery and methods of the new modern production in this case, right? Okay. So then out of that debacle came a renewed effort to try to create techniques of government and economics that would either put people in a better position within the capitalist system or make for a more socialized system. So, in other words, a technique made for a problem which then called for another technique. And this is a characteristic of technique. Technique seems like it solves one problem, maybe, or sometimes it just exists because people can do it. But if it solves a problem, it then creates at least another problem, and then you have to create more techniques for dealing with that problem. And there is, I would say, even though ultimately I think Ellul is saying this is a very dehumanizing process, there's a very human tendency here to always say confidently, at least since modernity, to say more and more confidently, we can create a technique to solve those problems. So if we do happen to shove peasants off the land and they're starving in the streets, that's no reason to go back to the other way of doing things. It's to forge ahead and to create the welfare state, or to, learn how to manipulate the economy through the use of technique so that we gain fuller employment and higher wages. Or it's, somehow creating techniques that transfer wealth from one group of people to the other and place more ownership of production into the hands of the state. In any case, there's always this sort of faith and hope that human techniques are endless and can endlessly solve problems. But reading Ellul gives you the sense that there's a certain insanity to all this, because human beings just keep up with that faith, and things just keep happening which are detrimental. There's a great example from the introduction that I really can't totally get into without taking a lot more time, but it has to do with DDT. And DDT was that, chemical that was going to get rid of mosquitoes, was going to get rid of malaria, but it had really bad effects upon a lot of animals in the environment, and got into our food supply, and then caused, in this case, rickets in calves, who drank milk from mothers with milk containing DDT. This gets into our children. Well, then we need to have medical science, and we need to have a renewed technique of, preventing this from developing. But with every technique, again, comes even more problems. So anyway, I have to stop it at that, but I will pick up with next time on Chapter 2 of Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society.